Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and if you've been wondering which of the 19 new skill gems is going to be relevant in the endgame and potentially meta worthy, you've come to the right place. In today's video, we're going to be going over the mechanics of each of the 19 new skills and the preliminary numbers we've seen in the announcement, and talk about which one might take the throne of the new meta. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to discuss why they might be good, what they might be good for, and how you might go about scaling them. So first up is the Earthbreaker Support. The support that essentially turns all slam skills into totems. We've seen very similar supports for bows and spells, but now we see one for melee and exclusively slams. So slams are one of the strongest archetypes in the game, featured prominently in hardcore, and I expect that's where this skill will shine. So overall, totems, specifically melee totems, have always been a powerful build, but have been power crept over the years. One of the most powerful builds when Shaper came out and was used to kill world first Shaper was War Chief totems. That's still in the game in the same current state, it's just been power crept. And this is an additional stage of power creep for that totem archetype. It's basically War Chief totems, but way better. So if we take a look at the gem here, we can see that it does have some fairly hefty damage penalties on them, like 19% less damage and 30% less attack speed, but traditionally totem gems have that be kind of mitigated as the gem levels up. So when it gets closer and closer to 20, and perhaps this gets rebalanced again before launch, you may see less and less damage, negative damage kind of multipliers on there. Now the payoff for totems is that you get an alternate playstyle to what you're traditionally using. So the big downside of melee is that you're melee, and totems mitigate that somewhat. A lot of the slam skills are pseudo range, specifically Sunder and also Tectonic Slam, so they do have some range to them, and totems you can place at range as well. So it extends your melee character significantly while still retaining a lot of the defensive capabilities of a melee character. So if you're doing something like or like Shaper or Uberod or anything like that, you're going to have much higher uptime in terms of your damage using a totem build overall than you would on another build. Now it still remains to be seen how this will interact with Exert, because Exert is one of the main scalers of slams, but overall I think it should be a massive increase in damage, as you can get a ton more totems than you can of your singular self. So you can get anywhere between 4 to 6 totems fairly easily as a chieftain or a hierophant, and that can potentially be effectively a 600% more multiplier. Obviously it's not quite that much when you take into effect the less damage and the less attack speed, but overall it can be incredibly powerful for direct damage builds. And I expect that the Earthbreaker support will be an incredibly meta choice, and I will see probably quite a few Earthbreaker support builds kind of popping up. And it will spawn probably a new archetype. Specifically, I expected to see on the Chieftain, because it really is kind of like the Chieftain kind of specialization. In terms of which slams I expect to see it with, I'm not entirely sure just yet, but I think overall this is going to be a much more hardcore kind of focused strategy. It always traditionally was a hardcore focused strategy to use melee-based totems, and I expect it to remain there for the most part. We may see it pop up on softcore, but the reason for that is because slams inherently are quite a lot slower than most other skills, and dying doesn't really have too big a penalty in softcore, so most players generally tend to go full glass cannon to kind of progress as fast as possible and skimp as much on gear as possible. And I'm not sure you can really achieve that using Earthbreaker support. So overall, it's probably going to make an incredibly tanky and incredibly powerful bosser. In terms of the clear, I'm not entirely sure it's going to feel amazing, but it doesn't look too bad with stuff like Tectonic Slam, especially if you use stuff like multiple totem support. Next up, we have the Berserker skill, which is, I believe, Rage Vortex. So Rage Vortex, essentially, it consumes your rage for a massive cooldown kind of effect. So if you actually take a look at it, it does do quite a lot of damage, and it scales up the amount of rage you have sacrificed. So this is pretty much Berserker only. It's pretty hard to get access to rage outside of Berserker, but it is going to be a massive damage boost for the Berserker archetype. So initially you might think this has negative synergy with Berserk, the actual the Berserk gem, but that actually probably isn't the case. It would probably damage your uptime just a little bit, but overall I expect the gameplay for Rage Vortex to be that you have a primary 6 link, you know, whether that's like, you know, a Reave, a Lightning Strike, or something like that. And then you have like a 4 link, maybe in your helmet or your gloves, of Rage Vortex, which you can pop on bosses for extra burst damage. I would treat it a little bit like a Vile skill, a big cooldown, and that is kind of the way I would kind of go with it. I wouldn't use it as my primary skill, even though Grinding Gear Games has advertised that it scales significantly with additional radius for amount of rage sacrifice. Overall, though, I think it's going to make a massive supplementary kind of effect to melee-based builds on bosses, and it's going to add an additional layer of burst damage to them, and that's kind of where it would go. The playstyle would probably be that you'd pop Berserk, pop Rage Vortex, and then go to town with your traditional melee setup, and that would give you a much higher burst damage at the really cost of just like a gem setup. So pretty good there. I think Rage Vortex may see some play, although I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. Its clear potential is incredibly weird. I don't think it's a very good clearing skill, but I could see use of it in terms of that bossing kind of burst damage setup. All right, what's next? We shall move on. I believe we have Boneshatter next. So I don't actually have to take a look at the gem for this one. Mechanically, this is going to be fairly weak. It functions very similarly to to Heavy Strike and Glacial Hammer. So overall, it's just mechanically not too powerful. It does have some pretty interesting effects with the AoE, but overall, just the fact that you have to be in pure melee to hit the pack or the boss is going to slow you down so much more than other character strategies. If you're interested in, you know, like playing around with it, you could probably have quite a lot of fun, but I can't see this ever being a extremely competitive pick in the high end game, and for that reason, I don't think it's going to ever be incredibly meta in softcore, and even hardcore, I think there are better options overall. And it also revolves around self-damaging, which, you know, can be mitigated, but it is also kind of dangerous. So overall, and like kind of failing any sort of like custom damage taken sort of kind of shenanigans that you can pull off with it, I don't think that this will see too much play in the meta, just purely from the fact that I can't ever imagine anyone heavy striking down the feed. It just doesn't seem viable to me. Next up, we have Defiance Banner. This one I don't need to spend too much time on. It's essentially a defensive banner, which we've seen a lot of, which reduces chance to take critical damage. So that's definitely pretty good. You'll probably see it most used on an Aura Stacker or an Aura Bot. It is fairly defensive. It's pretty good, but it does compete with other war banners. I know there's a unique which allows you to use multiple, but we will have to see. I don't think it's the most powerful banner, so it's probably not going to see an immense amount of play, in my opinion. Pending, obviously, any massive number tuning, which maybe it just gives you immunity to crits, but I find that unlikely. All right, moving on, we have Shield Crush. All right, so Shield Crush is a new melee-based kind of physical attack, which scales incredibly well currently with the numbers that they have provided off of your physical and evasion, your armor and evasion on your shield. The numbers are so high, in fact, that it does feel a little bit crazy. If you actually do read it, it's like it works out to be, you know, like 8 or like 900 base physical damage in some cases, which is completely ridiculous overall, and it can go way higher if you have like a 3000 armor shield, so it is completely insane. Now, how do I see this fitting into the meta? So I can see this having some use personally in a setup which already uses Spectral Shield Throw for clear. So you'd have Spectral Shield Throw in like a 4 link in your gloves or your helmet for your clear, and I imagine you'd have Shield Crush for your single target with its immense base damage and scaling for your single target setup. I'm not entirely sure if Spectral Shield Throw characters kind of use that kind of setup, whether it's like a big hit or bleed or anything like that. But overall, I think that's, if it's going to have any like kind of place, that's where it will probably belong, in that sort of archetype. I don't see anyone playing a pure Shield Crush build, because that really is just pure melee straight up all over again. And overall, pure melee, while it can be powerful in the form of slams and stuff like that, I don't expect Shield Crush, pure Shield Crush, to do much work, unfortunately. I think it's really going to be quite powerful in the context of like combining it with Spectral Shield Throw for clear and single target setup, because you can also shotgun with that immense base damage, but by itself, I think it's more of a supplementary single target skill, similar to how Barrage is for bow skills. Moving on. All right, next up, Behead. Behead gives you essentially a really small fraction of the power of Headhunter in a support gem. Now this is actually, you know, a pretty exciting concept for a lot of people, but as someone who has used a lot of Headhunters, and also as someone who has used a lot of Inspired Learnings, which this gem is actually far more similar to, it is actually completely underwhelming as a support gem, unfortunately. So let's just read it off. So far with current tuning, you get around 15% more damage, because 50% is low life, so it's 15% more damage on average. And the caveat is that you also have a 100% chance to steal one modifier from rare monsters, and you gain that for 20 seconds with a chance to refresh it when you hit a rare or unique enemy. So essentially you're maintaining one Inspired Learning charge throughout an entire map. That's essentially how it is. Now, one Inspired Learning charge, depending on what it is actually really not that powerful. And if you get something bad like Curse Immunity, or if you get something like really bad, you know, like, I don't know, like the Elemental Resistance one, it's basically a completely wasted support gem. And the fact that really hamstrings it is that you can only have one buff at a time, and anytime you get a new buff, it will then replace the old buff. So it's just mechanically not that powerful. If it had any more than one stack, it might see some use, but the fact that it has one stack really does hurt this to the point where I don't even think it's usable in its current state. The nice thing though, it does have a bit of melee range, but that's not really going to revive it. They need to add additional stack opportunities for this skill if they want people to use it, or they need to make it a normal support gem with normal amounts of damage. Otherwise it's probably just going to fall by the wayside, unfortunately. Moving right along, we have the next up here. We have, Stormrain. Okay, so this is our first true Omega competitor. I suppose the totems are pretty strong as well, but Stormrain is right up there in its viability. So we will talk a little bit about Stormrain, and there is quite a little bit to break down, because I think that this is potential to be on the level of a Toxic Rain. However, it won't have the innate scaling that Toxic Rain does. The thing that makes Toxic Rain such a powerful league starter is the fact that it has incredible base damage throughout the story and the early map kind of tiers. Stormrain doesn't have that base damage, but it has very powerful scaling and a similar kind of play style. So if you take a look at it here, it says that you can have 100 arrows in the ground. Essentially an arrow serves as like a conduit for beams to arc between. So if you have 3 arrows in the ground, you can see that the continual beams will continue to arc between those arrows. As you can see here in this example, you can see that. And you'll get 4 arcs in the base skill gem. I expect this to probably scale up to about 6 at max gem level, or probably additional arcs at maximum with a helm enchant, in fact. And overall, I expect it to be a fairly powerful skill. And my assumption here, though, is that these arcs can shotgun. The way that the skill seems to be designed in terms of its damage profile indicates that it should be able to shotgun, and I think that it probably will. So having 46% of base damage generally does mean that that's kind of rain of arrows territory, that it will be able to do that. At base, it fires one kind of a lightning conduit at a time, but additional projectiles scale that additional times. So let's say that you have 2 additional projectiles. As a Deadeye, you're firing 3 of the conduits which arc with Stormrain, and each of them, if they hit once, is 46% of your base damage, which is pretty good. Let's say that you can hit 2 of the beams of each of them, so that's, you know, double the damage again. So you can kind of see how this starts to really get quite powerful, and as a single target spell, as a physical conversion spell, it can be incredibly viable, perhaps even outscaling Barrage in some cases, but that remains to be seen. Overall, it could be incredibly powerful in terms of what it has to offer in terms of single target bow skills, as long as the shotgunning lines up, and it is also an area skill as well, so you can make that area, like, you know, kind of affected by conk effect, but you can also increase it by using increased area effect. So there's a lot of options here. The Deadeye is particularly appealing because it does indeed have the additional projectiles, which scales this the skill to an insane amount. Because it starts with 1 projectile and it can go all the way up to, you know, however much you want. Using a Death's Opus would take this up to 5 projectiles at once, creating a very nice AoE and single target cluster. And this spell really will be good at AoE and single target, assuming it shotguns, meaning it's a pretty damn good universal skill, and I'm a big fan of it and really excited to see how it plays out. I will definitely be trying it when the new league comes out. All right, next up, Ranger really has just got all of the juice this league in terms of the new skills. We'll be going into the next one, which I believe is the Ballista Support. So Focus Ballista essentially ties your Ballista's attacks to your own, Now, the thing that pretty much completely hamstrings this gem is that it's a support on the actual Ballista links themselves. So you have Ballista support, or Shrapnel Ballista, and then you have your other supports, and Ballistas are already heavily penalized for having the support gem on there. Unless that changes, that's how it currently is. Losing an additional support gem for only 30% more damage is brutal. And this honestly won't mitigate the fact that, you're giving up the massive autonomy of just having totems down themselves. So putting totems down is essentially, free uptime. It is incredibly powerful, and you'd much rather have them attack by themselves than be at your command. So this actual totem support needed to be so powerful that it actually offset the penalty of having them no longer be autonomous. And I'm not seeing those numbers here. It's possible that this scales incredibly well, or it gets further adjusted to the point where, it offsets that downside. But right now, the numbers just aren't there. It would need to be really, really over the top for me to ever consider using Focus Ballista on any of my Ballista builds, due to the fact that, you then lose the main advantage of being a totem build overall, and you lose massive uptime. All right, next up, perhaps one of the most exciting skills that they've added to the game, and that is the Explosive Concoction. So Explosive Concoction, to my knowledge, is the first ranged attack skill that you can use without wielding a weapon. I could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that it is. And this is particularly important because it opens up the avenue to using no weapon. So you can use Facebreaker now with a ranged weapon, well, with a ranged skill. And that is incredibly insane. But the thing that you can use to make it take it even further is, in fact, Hollow Palm. So Hollow Palm is a unique cluster jewel that essentially allows you to really, really lean into dexterity stacking. Which is incredibly powerful. If you look it up and look up Hollow Palm builds, you'll understand just how powerful they are. And in previous leagues, they have been some of the most powerful builds overall, and they have been reasonably cheap as well. Explosive Concoction essentially allows Hollow Palm players to now have a ranged option. In addition to that, I do also want to draw particular attention to how it's currently tuned. It says it does 77 to 116 fire damage, and that is actually twice as much as Armageddon Brand is at level 1. They're the same gem level. Overall, obviously Armageddon Brand is a little bit more, well, a lot more powerful in terms of its quality of life, but that is a lot of flat damage, not even counting the amount of added cold and lightning damage you do if you lean into the flask kind of side of things here. So it's completely crazy, has insane endgame scaling. The only thing is that's holding it back is that it's not a traditional projectile. It's more of a lobbed projectile. So it's basically going to be a point and shoot. As you can see, it kind of goes over mobs and stuff like that. It's basically going to do an explosion where your cursor is, and it does function kind of like a magma orb or a rolling magma, but only with no chains, no bounces. So it will be a bit of an interesting play style, but it has insane damage numbers right now and has insane scaling potential in the future. I fully expect this to be a endgame viable build using Hollow Palm, assuming that it survives the patches. All right, what do we have next on the agenda? Moving on. Ambush. All right, so Ambush is a bit of an interesting one. It's a brand new exert Warcry, essentially for supposedly the Shadow archetype. Unfortunately, there's not too many meta or in-meta kind of Shadow melee skills. Overall, you wouldn't use this with something like Flicker Strike. You really wouldn't use this with something like Viper Strike because it scales critical strike chance and critical strike multiplier. So overall, this is going to be used on like other melee skills, but unfortunately, other Warcries in their current state just completely outclass Ambush, and using Ambush restricts what other Warcries you can use. So overall, it's not a very competitive choice in its current form, but obviously balance can change that. But right now, it's not too appealing as an endgame skill. All right, moving right along. We have Voltaxic Burst. So Voltaxic Burst is a pretty interesting one. We will quickly cover it. Overall, it does feel a little on the clunky side. It's going to be pretty hard to make this build feel good without reduced duration or some very, very interesting kind of gameplay style mechanics. You have to basically preload your damage and make sure it goes off at the right time when you're in the pack. Obviously, the trade-off though is that you get free Explodey. However, this Explodey is not what we once are used to. This Explodey does not chain off of itself. It is corpse destruction. It will help with feel good clear, but overall, Voltaxic Burst seems to suffer from the fact that it's not very kind of quality of life. It's kind of like a weird, janky kind of anomaly. I'm sure someone might find a way to make it good, but when I first saw it, before I heard about the cast on crit nerfs, my first reaction was cast while channeling or cast on crit. That is potentially an option, but overall it does seem a little bit weird, but it does lean into the Voltaxic kind of archetype. So if you're a Voltaxic Rift fan, you can use Voltaxic Rift and this skill to get 100% lightning to chaos, which could be potentially interesting, but overall it does seem a little bit weird and janky to play, and it definitely wouldn't be at the top of my list as a pick for a high meta contender. All right, on to Witch, which is very, very exciting indeed. We do have Blade Trap here, but I recommend checking out Taki Cat's video because I have no idea about traps at all. So I'm not going to comment on this one, but everything else, fair game. All right, moving right along. Summon Reaper. Okay, this one is quite impressive, and it does have quite a lot of potential. I'm going to talk quite a little bit about Summon Reaper and its viability. So currently, Summon Reaper is being marketed as a singular kind of minion build, which you can kind of feed minions to, and it can consume for buffs and healing and all sorts of stuff like that. It's important to note that it is a minion that can die, so the most direct comparison of Reaper is to Herald of Agony. If it's being marketed as a singular based minion build, that is basically the only comparison we have. So when you compare the two, Herald of Agony has ranged attacks, it also has projectile based attacks, and it has reasonably okay AoE. Reaper is a melee based minion, and it doesn't seem to have any incredible AoE skills right now, although you do have an on-demand cooldown, which does seem to do some sort of AoE. But overall, I would say that it's a weaker, clear version of Herald of Agony overall. And to be honest, Herald of Agony is widely considered one of the most slow clear speed skills in the entire game. As it currently stands, I think Herald of Agony would be the superior choice, purely from the fact that Herald of Agony does in fact not have a life bar. So if you're in the field and this thing dies, well, you just lost all of your damage, or you have to wait to resummon it. And that can be a little bit inconsistent, specifically with Breach Lord invitations and stuff like that in the endgame. So overall, while Reaper does sound really cool, in its current iteration, I don't see it being viable as a singular clear skill. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use Reaper. Reaper is, in fact, in my opinion, pretty viable, depending on how powerful the numbers are, as part of your army squad. So right now, it only applies 20% less damage and less life to your entire squad. That's obviously a fairly large damage penalty, but we don't know how powerful the Reaper is. Is the Reaper powerful enough to basically outstrip that damage penalty? Potentially. We don't know how good he is, and I think he's probably going to be more powerful and more clear viable as a character and more well-rounded when you put him with something like Carrion Golems, when you put him with something like Zombies, or something like that. Overall, I think he's probably well-suited to being in that kind of thing. Maybe Carrion Golems are on a 4-link, and they're kind of your AoE clear, and then the Reaper, while still nerfing the Carrion Golems, they're good enough for clear, is your single target, and it can kind of consume the Carrion Golems at will, and that's kind of the way I would approach this skill. Now the thing is, Reaper, as I mentioned, does consume minions, so he is actually completely at odds with Animate Guardian. So if you're using Reaper, you are foregoing the option to have an Animate Guardian, meaning you will lose Critical Strike multiplier on your minions, and you'll also lose Cull, as well as a bunch of other quality of life. So the Reaper does need to be very, very powerful, or the penalties associated with Reaper need to be fully mitigated by gem levels, or they need to be mitigated by an alternate quality gem, or something like that, in order for Reaper probably to beat out the Animate Guardian overall. But I think that Reaper does have a pretty good shot at potentially joining the ranks of most people's army of minions, and it will replace the pesky old annoying Animate Guardian, I hope. It might be a bit annoying if he keeps eating your Frenzy Charge Spectres though, so hopefully there's some form of smart targeting so he doesn't eat all of your Spectres, but overall pretty cool. Alright, next up we have... what do we have next? Forbidden Rite. So Forbidden Rite is a bit of an interesting one. I'm not going to talk too much about it because we don't know exactly how it works. I'm going to compare it mostly to Ice Spear. So Ice Spear is basically a projectile-based skill that has one base projectile by itself, and then it can scale insanely based on the amount of projectiles you add to it. So if we assume that Forbidden Rite can shoot one projectile at a target, and if you have +3 projectiles, it then instead shoots 4 projectiles at a target, I think this is a T1 clear speed skill, well not clear speed, T1 single target based skill, and it probably will see immense play due to the fact it scales off of your energy shield and life. You do need to have considerable chaos resist or be CI to even think about using this skill overall. And I believe if you compare this wording to Dark Pact, you will still gain the additional base chaos damage even if you are immune to chaos damage or mitigate it. That's the way I read it. Overall, I think it's going to be a pretty powerful skill if you play it as CI, and I expect it to probably look a little bit like Bladefall Blade Blast if they get the tuning right, and you can easily get access to Chaos Inoculation gear, or overall, you know, that's kind of my approach to it. And it also needs to have that single target scaling, where you can kind of like, if you kind of know what I mean. All right, finally, Eye of Winter, the mighty frozen orb from Diablo 2. Let's take a look. So overall, this is probably one of the weakest skills that they've revealed in terms of damage numbers currently. They have been very, very conservative with how they've scaled it. It is pretty much like weaker than a freezing pulse right now, even if you shotgun every single projectile on it, which is pretty absurd in my opinion. So let's quickly take a look at it, and I'll talk a little bit more about it because I know a lot of people are super duper excited about Eye of Winter. So Eye of Winter. Incredibly low base damage, incredibly low effective added damage. Now, the thing is, you can offset this by the fact that you're able to project shotgun all of the projectiles which it fires. And in the final explosion, it fires 8 of them. So overall, it should have about an effective damage kind of multiplier of 200%, which is completely on par with Freezing Pulse. So if you shoot the Eye of Winter and every single projectile shotguns a target, it's basically like a Freezing Pulse level of damage single target. Is that good? Absolutely not. That's awful. So overall, it's going to have pretty poor single target unless we see some other dimension here which can scale it further. I hope they tune numbers up on this one because it's incredibly weak right now. And in terms of the clear, it's kind of like a frisbee that shoots out EK Novas. That's the way I look at it, which could be potentially fairly strong, but you need to scale everything that you do on EK Nova. You either need to scale Pierce, projectile speed, you need to either go like maybe like fork or chain. Those are the kind of things you need to look into, and that's a lot of different dimensions that you need to scale on this skill already. So it's got low damage, it has incredible requirements for scaling, and overall that just means it's not going to be a very smooth skill to league start in its current state, and it's probably going to be one of those skills that might be pretty damn cool when you invest a ton into it. All right. Finally, we have the Templar. We'll run on through this. First up, we have Battlemage's Cry. So Battlemage's Cry is probably going to see an incredible amount of play with the Inquisitor, as it does just perfectly synergize with the Inquisitor and Battlemage. I think it's probably going to be a very, very powerful leveling and early act skill. I maybe can expect some builds to probably use it in the end game, but it does split your focus very, very heavily between a strike and kind of spell, kind of caster kind of style. And it's not at a place where I think it will be used in the ultimate end game. I think it'll get outscaled by different strategies, but I can see it being one of the most powerful strategies for leveling throughout the acts as a Templar, and also leveling through early maps, and maybe you could use it on Shaper as well. It might be just okay there. That's my kind of assessment of Battlemage's Cry. I think next up we have the let's take a quick look. We've got Manabond. Okay, dude, this is probably one of the more powerful skills that they've announced, and with the current numbers, it's completely absurd. So I do just want to quickly draw attention to the actual area of this character. I believe this character is stacking a significant amount of area, but the actual size of the mana sigil is incredibly large. It's huge, but you do also need to take into account that this character has an incredible large power, sigil of power as well. So this character is clearly stacking AoE. But overall, it does seem like a skill that really can blow up the whole screen. Now, the thing that makes this incredibly powerful is its synergy with Archmage. So right now, it doesn't have a flat mana cost. It actually has a percentage mana cost, which can be scaled with support gems, meaning that you can actually achieve a massive percent chunk out of your mana pool, which will then be converted to additional lightning damage using the Archmage support. In addition to that, if you combine this with like spam casting, or maybe even with a Pledge of Hands, and you can get your mana pool low enough, and you want to get it low enough, you can get additional damage based off of your missing mana. So you can really amp up the damage and the kind of burst, and it could be an incredible source of actual just raw DPS. Which is really exciting, and I expect this skill to see quite a lot of play, and I'll be making a build around it, pending any massive Archmage nerfs, which I hope not to see, but it does seem incredibly powerful overall, and it probably is going to be a fairly good synergy with Battlecry's Mage, if you decide to go kind of down like some sort of Mind Over Matter kind of Inquisitor build. All right, the last one here we have is Absolution. So Absolution, it's going to be pretty difficult to assess this one, but my initial response to Absolution is that you would use it in combination with Dominating Blow, kind of to give you like an even bigger minion army overall. But you know, it might be a little bit clunky to scale the kind of spell cast and also the melee sort of style, but that does seem to be Templar's kind of niche. So the overall kind of goal that I'd be going for with this skill is to have Dominating Blow along with Herald of Purity, along with Absolution, to get kind of an alternative Guardian kind of summoner style with tons and tons of minions that you can kind of walk around. Functionally, it's essentially exactly like Dominating Blow, but it's a spell, and overall the minions are ranged, which can, you know, introduce some pretty interesting mechanics, and it can introduce some pretty good, you know, clear mechanics as well. So pretty interesting there. And our final skill will be the Blade Helix, I believe it's called, which is essentially hammered in from D2. Lots of inspiration from D2 here. And this is probably one of the most interesting skills that they have announced. So Chris has let us know that this is not how the skill is going to function, which is in this promotional material. He wasn't happy with it, but overall, just looking at the gem damage effectiveness currently and how it looks in game, if each one of those projectiles actually is what the skill says, like the damage effectiveness of the skill, which it says, it is completely absurd. If we just skip to it here, like if each one of those little swords is basically 160% of your effective damage, that is completely ridiculous. In addition to the fact that it can actually bounce and rotate again. So each of the projectiles has insane damage effectiveness. It scales with projectiles, like how many projectiles you have, it seems, and also they persist, and in addition to that, you can augment the actual distance in which the projectile has to travel. So the current thinking for me is that this could possibly be the highest single target DPS skill in the game, with enough scaling and enough, you know, like projectile scaling. And the reason for that is that there is currently some discussion that you could set up two frost walls, because this skill can ricochet and bounce off walls 100% of the time. You could basically set up two frost walls and just infinitely ricochet the Spectral Helix back between them to get insane shotgun potential, which would just be absolutely absurd amounts of single target. Obviously, we don't know if this is going to be the case. We don't know if you can bounce the blades off of the frost wall. We don't know if they have a rearming time, but overall, it's probably a completely abysmal clear skill, as we see in the trailer here. But it's probably fairly reasonably good at doing bosses. I imagine it probably could be absolutely crazy for doing single target damage if you can get that mechanic going. So overall, hope you guys have enjoyed my review of the new skills and kind of where they might sit in the meta. We definitely have some massive contenders for really heavy hitters in terms of new meta builds. I'm very excited to see and say. Based off current numbers, a few of them do seem like they need to be tuned up, and a few of them seem a little bit outlandish in terms of their numbers, and they probably will be tuned down. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the new skills that they have on offer. There seems to be a lot of new playstyles to try out, and there's going to be a lot of new builds coming out of the woodwork, especially with a massive nerf to pretty much every single build in the game currently. There's going to be a lot of things to try. So hopefully you guys have been enjoying the video, and make sure you sub if you want more, and stay tuned for plenty more 3.15 content related to builds and everything to do with it. So like I said, guys, see you guys in the next one. Cheers.